Give me the meat, and give it to me raw.
We just wanted an excuse to play that clip again. Hello and welcome back to HateWatchers. We've got a very special video for you today. The first entry into a new series called How They Tried to Trick Us. These videos are going to go over all the different tricks certain shows and movies tried to play on us. The purpose of these underhanded moves varies greatly from show to show, but they all have the same effect of disrespecting fans as well as fostering ill will toward the brand. No one likes getting tricked, and no one likes the feeling that someone else thought they even could be tricked. It's an insult to their intelligence. And few try to trick people more often than modern shows, especially those whose IP have an existing fan base built by previous shows, movies, books, or video games. So what kind of tricks are we talking about? We're talking about hijacking popular brands and IPs, butchering established lore and legacy characters, marketing the show as something completely different than what we get, fostering artificial media coverage, playing on fans' nostalgia of the quote good times, shoehorning in fan service, or last-minute tricks that attempt to change your perception of the show moving forward. Most shows nowadays try and pull at least some of these, and of course there's the rare unicorn of a show that tries to pull every single one. And what's the purpose of these tricks? What are they trying to accomplish? Well, that also varies from show to show. These goals range from getting us to check out the show in the first place, tuning in every week, creating buzz no matter how negative, distracting us from the truly awful parts of the show, or from the fact that they're just wearing this brand as a skin suit to push their own story, and all the way to tuning into the next season where things will be better, trust us. Well, today we have a shining example of creators and a production studio pulling out all the stops to trick people into viewing their crap. And of course, that's Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Now, the problems with The Rings of Power are well documented. You just need to check out some of our videos on the show to see the deafening criticism the show has received. But we're not here to beat a dead horse, and no horse is deader than The Rings of Power right now. So we're taking a different approach, and we're not going to focus on the same old problems that we've discussed before. That means we're not going to be talking about the hilariously terrible hollow dialogue, the mediocre acting, the show being boring as fuck, the poor storytelling, the horrendous pacing, the slow build-up, or the shattering of existing lore. Well, maybe a little bit on that last one, but you'll see. And to be fair, we should also make some mention of the things that the show did well, which were, well, there were some nice landscape shots. But today we're focusing on the tricks the Rings of Power tried to pull on us. That list of tricks we're talking about includes hijacking a beloved IP with established lore, weaponizing nostalgia, the huge investment in the show, a massive and lengthy marketing campaign, and spinning up negative media coverage to generate buzz and interest. Well, enough of laying out the groundwork, let's get right into it, starting at the top with how this show abused the Lord of the Rings brand to entice viewers. The Lord of the Rings franchise hardly needs any introduction. With the novel garnering fans ever since its publication in 1954 and 1955, and a run of blockbuster films from 2001 to 2003, the fanbase quite possibly numbers in the hundreds of millions. And of course, we call it the Lord of the Rings franchise, but it's really an all-encompassing term for the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. So the established lore we're talking about comes from the Hobbit, the Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings, and other written works of Tolkien. While the movies had their own deviations from the lore, most were forgiven as being necessary to adapt the books to the big screen. And it's easier to forgive when taking into account the millions of new fans that the movies brought into the fold. Without the massive popularity and brand recognition that the movie trilogy brought, you'd never see Amazon investing $1 billion into the Rings of Power. As part of the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien universe, the Rings of Power benefits from this existing fandom and the high level of brand recognition. The fans have an immediate interest and buy-in with your new product. But those benefits come with some unspoken conditions, the largest of which is that you, the creators, respect the story told before you and don't contradict what's been told previously, especially when it comes to those original works from Tolkien himself. And this is where Amazon tried to pull its first trick on us. They knew that they'd have a built-in audience regardless of what kind of story they set out to tell. And rather than respecting the lore and giving fans an enjoyable story that fits within the universe they love, Amazon chose to twist and corrupt the lore to match the story they wanted to tell. They wanted an ass-kicking girl boss to lead the show. They wanted her to be strong and independent. They wanted to sprinkle in patriarchal figures that were just holding her back. So what did they do? They changed Galadriel into a martial warrior who was quick to anger and slow to learn. They removed her canon husband for the time being. They removed her seniority to King Gil-galad and Elrond so they can appear to talk down to her. This is fundamental character assassination to fit the contemporary narrative Amazon wanted to tell about the modern woman. And it's on par with what The Last Jedi did to Luke Skywalker's character. Galadriel was an existing character with plenty written about her, and you don't get to change or contradict what Tolkien wrote without getting well-deserved backlash from the fans. And there's plenty of other lore violations the show made in pursuit of the story they wanted, like having no Anatar, Lord of Gifts, crafting the rings out of order, implying Sauron killed Galadriel's brother Finrod, having more than one dwarf named Durin alive, including racial diversity on characters whose in-universe race has real-world ethnic roots simply for diversity's sake, Galadriel's lack of using magic, the timeline being completely condensed, locations being changed, and the right to voyage to Valinor having to be earned. The list goes on from there, but we simply don't have the time to talk about all the missteps here. There's an argument that says, well, they don't have the rights to things like Anatar, so they can't show it. They don't have the rights to Finrod's death, so they can't show it. Well, if a company doesn't have the rights to something, the correct approach for an entity that wants to respect the established lore is to not touch it. You don't get to rewrite it. You don't get to twist it to conform to your desires. And doing so is a form of disrespect to that which came before your time, as well as to the fans, and this is unfortunately all too common these days. Now, does all of this constitute a skinsuit? Well, not quite. And if you don't know what we mean by a skinsuit, we're probably going to have a future video on the concept. But essentially, it's when some form of media is just wearing a well-known, established brand as a skinsuit and masquerading under that false veneer. So in this case, it would look and sound like Lord of the Rings, but it would act and feel different. The Rings of Power doesn't quite earn the skinsuit designation, however. The show still told a Lord of the Rings story in general, even if it wasn't a very good take on one. But it avoids being considered a skinsuit, at least for this season. It certainly wasn't anywhere near the kind of skinsuit the Halo show had on. We'll also have a clear review next season of whether the creators are going to continue telling a quote Lord of the Rings story, or if they're intent on pushing the characters and storylines created just for this show to the forefront and using this brand as merely a vessel to do so. So standing here with the first season wrapped up, we have to ask, did this trick work? Well, unfortunately, yeah, we have to say that it did work. The goal was to get people to tune in and to keep them tuning in. Well, people certainly tuned in for the release, with an estimated 25 million viewers in the first 24 hours for the 2-episode premiere. This is more than twice that of the far superior House of the Dragon, whose premiere garnered just under 10 million viewers. So clearly the Lord of the Rings brand had some built-in draw. Was the show able to retain viewers? Well, that's more of a gray area, as final numbers still aren't in. We do know, however, that viewership dropped with each episode, but it should be noted that this is actually the norm for every show. There were certainly still millions of people watching or hate watching each week, so we still have to say that this trick worked and accomplished its goal for season 1. Will it work for season 2? It doesn't look like it, but time will tell. Closely related to the lore issue, we have to discuss how this show tried to weaponize the warm feelings of nostalgia in viewers. And they even shattered the lore to do so. Fans and even casual viewers absolutely loved the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and many have been eager to return to this beautiful, grandiose fantasy world full of rich characters and interesting stories to tell. So they were ready to buy in once Amazon announced that they'd be taking fans back to Middle-earth. That nostalgia alone can be considered a trick if fans wouldn't otherwise check the Rings of Power out without the Lord of the Rings moniker. But Amazon Studios and the creators took things a step further, shoehorning in characters that have no business being in this story. This, of course, being the Harfoots and Gandalf. The Harfoots have their place in Tolkien's lore, to be fair, no matter how insignificant it is. But they didn't have anything to do with the story of forging the rings and the war with Sauron. So whatever part they're gearing up to play probably has no basis in the lore, and their inclusion was simply a cheap attempt at scoring nostalgic fan service points. We all loved those hobbits from the movies, but fans didn't much care for these bastardized cousins of theirs. But their inclusion is nothing compared to the absolutely lore-shattering move they made throwing Gandalf into this story. Gandalf doesn't arrive to Middle-earth until the Third Age, thousands of years after the time the Rings of Power takes place. The creators just had to drag Gandalf into this show, hoping that it'll make casual viewers connect this show in their minds to the movies they loved 20 years ago. It's the cheapest of the cheap tricks to try and pull, and they should be ashamed of themselves for going to the length of lore destruction that they did to do this. And probably the worst part of it is there's no other reason for including him in this story. There were 2 blue wizards present at some point in the Second Age. If they simply wanted a wizard in the show, fans would have loved to learn more about one of the blue wizards. But Amazon valued fan service and weaponized nostalgia over respecting Tolkien's writings. And we'll of course put the usual disclaimer that there's no official word that this is Gandalf, but all the hints are there, so any change now would simply be done in response to fan backlash. So did this trick of preying on viewers' nostalgic feelings work? Well, there was some mixed success with this trick. Yes, the Lord of the Rings world certainly drove people to watch the show, at least at the beginning. But by the end of the season, there were more negative voices discussing these inclusions than there were positive ones. So the nostalgia got people to tune in, but it did not hold their interest from the look of things. Moving on to the next trick, this one is far more simple than the lore or the nostalgia, and that's the budget for this show. Everyone has heard time and time again that this show cost $1 billion. Amazon invested $1 billion into the Rings of Power. Amazon themselves loved to go around and tout this as the most expensive show ever made, and they claim the first season alone cost nearly $500 million to produce. Big price tags come with big expectations. You don't drop $90,000 on a Mercedes and expect it to drive like an '01 Honda Civic. Needless to say, people had high hopes for the show and the production quality. Well, there were some good settings and some great CGI and effects from time to time, but there's not much else to speak of that warrants this first season's price tag. And the money sure as shit didn't go to writers or actors. Even without taking an overly critical eye to it, it's clear that nothing about this show really felt like it warranted such a ridiculous budget. So did this trick work? Did the flashy numbers make people tune in, and did the quality blow people away and want them to come back next week? Well, it may have drawn enough eyeballs for the premiere, but viewers didn't see or feel that level of quality throughout the first season. On to the next trick. A hefty chunk of that $1 billion went into the marketing campaign, and it was a long campaign. It started back in November of 2017 with the announcement of the show, and it was kicked into high gear in January 2022, 9 months before the show aired, with a promotional teaser that revealed the show's title. They went on to have 3 long trailers in the lead up to the release, none of which actually provided any information on the story for the show. By the time the show had released, we had endured months of trailers, commercials, and online ads for the Rings of Power. They were simply everywhere. But their marketing efforts didn't stop there, as Amazon pulled out all the stops and even went all in on off-the-wall approaches. These included wrapping Amazon lockers with ads for the Rings of Power, renaming them to characters and places from the show, designing Amazon shipping boxes after the show's factions, wrapping their delivery vans, and a bizarre series of posters focusing on their characters' hands. And we can't forget the hilariously ridiculed influencer events.
If like Sauron is hot, I feel like people will be like, I can fix him.
Middle-earth had like a club.
Yo, this tune is banging!
All the while, every major publication was being peppered with fluff pieces hyping up the show. It even went meta, as the exorbitant amount of money spent on making and marketing the Rings of Power became a new way to market the Rings of Power, constantly talking about the money they put into it. But did any of it work? Did it get people to watch the show and talk about it leading up to the release? Yes. Yes, it did. Regardless of our opinion of the show, there's no denying that people wanted to watch it when it premiered, and there was a ton of buzz around the Rings of Power. Speaking of the buzz around the show, that segues nicely into the last trick Amazon tried to pull to get people discussing the Rings of Power. This was, of course, their spinning up of negative media coverage and sensational headlines. Before the show even came out, a big chunk of the coverage of the Rings of Power revolved around the show's diversity and how people should rally behind the show to strike back against those evil racist trolls, because all of our colors come together to make a rainbow. Just search Rings of Power racist, and the search results are flooded with articles discussing how this show is going to be magical and anyone not liking it is racist or something. I mean, just look at the dates, they all came out within 3 days of each other. They even trotted out the cast of the Lord of the Rings movies to get on camera and denounce racism in these dumb little shirts that still have the fold creases in them because the PR team just handed them out backstage. Just look at this headline if you don't believe Amazon is out there stoking this kind of media coverage. First off, look at the date. This came out 2 weeks before the show did. Then the headline and subheadline hit 3 major points of their desired marketing. It strikes back against the racists, it touts the show's diverse cast, and finally it mentions the $1 billion spent on the show. I mean, it's truly shameless marketing once you see it being done so blatantly in what is pretending to be journalism. So, were they able to get this trick to work and spark some buzz about the show among potential viewers? Well, there's a reason marketing campaigns keep going back to the well on this fake race-baiting approach. It works. The sheer amount of online chatter alone is evidence that this trick worked, as the Rings of Power was pushed to the forefront of many pop culture conversations. Now it's time to recap all 5 of the tricks Amazon Studios and the Rings of Power creators tried to pull on us to get us to watch this crap, and whether or not they pulled it off. First off, they tried to get people to tune into their show and stick around by setting their story in the beloved Tolkien universe. And we think this trick was pulled off successfully. Many millions of viewers showed up for the premiere, and millions were still watching by the end of the season. Secondly, you have the nostalgia factor and whether or not it drove fans to watch the show, and if the cheap bits of fan service kept them interested. This was more of a mixed bag. Those warm, fuzzy feelings of nostalgia definitely played a part in getting eyeballs on the premiere, but by the end of the season, the attempts to elicit those feelings had those eyes rolling. Next up, we have the mega budget factor. Did the hefty price tag placed on the show pique people's interest and blow them away with quality? As we've mentioned repeatedly, the premiere had 25 million viewers in the first 24 hours alone, and you'd be hard-pressed to argue that the financial outlay for the Rings of Power didn't help drive those numbers up. But there's no way in hell the show felt like a billion-dollar production. On to the next trick, we looked at the long and ubiquitous marketing campaign for the show, and we determined that it was successful as well. People tuned in, and more importantly, they were talking about the show, which is what Amazon was aiming for. And lastly, we have the too often used media spin trick, where studios will stoke sensational media coverage of a show or movie to generate buzz. Here, Amazon's gain is society's loss, as the old
"Our fans are just racist if they don't like our crap"
trick worked yet again. Well, now you know some of the tricks Amazon Studios and the creators tried to pull on us with the Rings of Power, and how successful they were in our opinion. And we already talked in a previous video about how Season 2 was already written before any criticism came in from the first season, and the creators aren't likely to make any changes at this point. So expect to see these same tricks repeated in the second season. Now we should mention here that Amazon can do what they want with the story and what they bought the rights to. It's theirs, they own it. But they then also need to take the backlash they deserve without complaint. You don't get to destroy something beautiful, hand us the ashes, ask for money, and then call us racist for not liking it. Expect all of that to continue in Season 2 as well. Speaking of Season 2, hit that red subscribe button to join the fun when the next season drops, where we'll be hate watching it just like we did with Season 1. Also, consider liking the video if you liked it, as it helps our videos reach more struggling fans out there. And let us know in the comments below, are there any other tricks the Rings of Power tried to pull that you think we missed? Do you think they'll try any new tricks with the second season? Thank you for joining us today, and for making it to this point in the video, and we'll catch you on the next one.